Okay, I'd like to call this meeting to order. This is a special meeting of the Pear Beach Building Committee. This is Wednesday, February 12th. Before we move on to, the main portion of the agenda, just a couple of housekeeping things. So first off, this meeting was originally intended for last Wednesday as a regular meeting, and in response to a request from Neil Halpin, who's recently added some new members who will be introduced to us this evening, Neil asked for another week just to coordinate and kind of do some information exchange to get ready with the new members of the team. So it's been moved to this week. For those of you who understand how this stuff works, when we move it kind of on the short notice, it turns into a special meeting. So that's an explanation for that. It's critical. The other point here is that this is a very, very busy evening here at Town Hall. We tried to get other rooms, and we tried to get a bit more time as well. We were not successful. So we have a hard stop on this room at 7. We have another group coming in at 7:30, so we'll do everything we possibly can to get out of here in advance of it so we don't hold them up. With that, and just so folks aren't trying to read too much into this, the key event here is to have the team present information to us that's critically important for us to understand. And we just need to allow as much time as possible, especially given the hard stop, for those guys to do that. Time permitting, will allow time, of course, for public comment. And just kind of in terms of a technicality with special meetings, we're all learning about how these meetings work. We're not actually obligated to have public comment. We want public comment, but what's critically important to us this evening is just to hear what this team has to tell us. And we do have a meeting coming up right after this at 7:30. So for those of you who, if we don't get to public comment, for those of you who would like to make a public comment, please join us at our next meeting, which is the commission meeting, and we'll welcome public comment at that point. So hope that explanation clears things up for anybody who might have some questions. So with that, at this point, I will turn it over to Neil and team and Dan, and thank you guys very much for coming.
Sure. So let me just start by introducing Craig Flaherty from Redness and Mead and Devin Santa from Race. And they are the newest members of our team. One of the reasons that Dan and I felt it was important to reach out to them was stemmed from the fact that we got a lot of comments from the public about flooding in the parking lot, and that was an increasingly difficult problem that affected the use of the beach. And so as Dan was starting to prepare his CAM report, the Coastal Area Management application, we just felt that we wanted to make sure we had the right information with which to move things along from this point forward. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Dan.
And if I could just remind everybody, we've got a little bit of an issue with the TV 79 gear this evening, so it's important that you guys kind of move the mic around and speak directly to the mic if possible.
So, good evening, everyone. Quickly, for tonight's agenda, I'm going to go through the analysis of the site. I will give Craig and Devin a chance to introduce themselves, a little background on who they are. We'll review some, again, pretty technical tonight, about some of the data of the grades of the parking area, looking at some actual flooding events and projections. I'm going to review a bit about the CAM report outline, what that entails. We really go through what the next steps for the committee needs to decide as the next meetings progress. But first, just want to reiterate some of the priorities and key considerations that we've been working through in this whole process. And these are really out of the RFP that was the basis for this project. The first, and these are in no particular order, but the first is to protect views, maintain the natural qualities of the beach park area. Second, provide sidewalks and pedestrian access through the beach park area. Third, to improve beach resiliency and reduce wind water erosion by increasing natural shoreline areas. As you know, that there's a lot of sand that has been built up specifically during storm events that has eroded or washed over into the parking area. And now for this next one is to prevent the dispersal of sand onto the parking area, particularly during high tides and storm events. Next, to raise the parking lot elevation to minimize flooding and beach erosion. And third, to repair and reconstruct the boat launch. So these are really the basis for a lot of the site work that we're talking tonight. Neil's been talking about the building so far, so we're going to pause on that component of the project. But But everything we'll be showing you, actually, they work very seamlessly together. The grades we'll be talking about, everything Neil's been working on, works with everything you're seeing tonight. So it all works as one complete puzzle piece together. Key considerations to accomplish these priorities. The first is the balance between the views and buffers. We've talked about this a lot in the past, just balancing that need to buffer the resource areas while also preserving the views that are into and out of the park space. We want to maintain beach accessibility, so when looking at where is the parking area, how to get to beach areas, we maintain that access, that connectivity between the beach area to the parking lot and to the concession building as well. We want to have resilient plans, so when storms come or a projected sea level rise happens, we have a plan that's going to be lasting for years to come. Not that we've addressed it this year, and next year, with whatever event happens, that you're in the same position as this year. So really looking forward, we're projecting out, and having a plan that's really going to be resilient for years to come. Related to the boat launch, we're looking at trailer maneuverability, so access around the parking area, making sure that we are maintaining parking as well as circulation patterns so that users are comfortable using this space and it is a functioning parking lot. And finally, getting through permitting and state, local, and federal permitting process, so abiding by all rules, regulations, making sure that we're going through proper channels for state and local permitting. That's just an underlying key consideration that everything we're talking about, we do have that requirement that we're going to have to follow through with, and that's the best interest of the town. Really quickly on the pictures on the right-hand side, just for perspective, and sorry it's a little grainy, but the view on the right, many can see, this is looking out more or less from the concession building out towards the harbor area. And although it doesn't look nice, this is actually a wetland area. You can see when the water's at low tide, just how different it is in that low water event. And the picture here, I think Craig took maybe just after the first of the year. This is when that view, similar view, is actually, this is the curb line is actually right here, and the water had washed up into the parking lot. So although you can't see the asphalt, it's under there. But those are two kind of balancing. We're taking this low water and high water event that a lot of discussion we'll have tonight will be on those two components. So really quickly, I want to just let Craig and Devin give you a little introduction to who they are, besides what Neil said.
My name?
That's your name? Yeah.
You know me, hello. My name is Craig Flaherty. I'm a professional engineer licensed in the state of Connecticut. I am the president and senior engineer of Redis & Mead, which is a land use consulting company based in Stamford, providing land surveying, site civil engineering, and zoning consulting services. My background is basically that, 25 years of providing land use consulting services, site design, and site engineering with a specific emphasis on stormwater and floodplain management, predominantly in Fairfield County. I've worked a lot in town. I worked for North Yacht Club, Northern Presbyterian Church, the Anderson Memorial Trust, Weaver Country Club, and also working on the one of the two Grove Heights projects, just for familiarity with local regulations as well. I have served a number of boards and committees in the town of Darien. Two past ones were the Environmental Protection Commission, which in the town of Darien is the Conservation Commission, the Wetlands Agency, and the Flood Erosion Control Board. I served on a flood mitigation strategy committee that reported directly to the selectmen that dealt at the time mostly with riverine flooding after some of the floods the town experienced in 2007, 2008. Currently, I do serve on the Area and Sewer Commission and the Advisory Committee on Sustainability. I should say very clearly for the record that I am not here at all in my capacity on either of those committees. None of my comments should be taken as endorsements from either of those committees. I am clearly here as a paid consultant working for Neil Hawk Architects. So I think that's my introduction.
Thanks, Greg. A little bit about myself. My name is Kevin Santa, and I'm president of Race Coastal Engineering. Race Coastal Engineering is a firm based in Stratford, Connecticut. We've been in business for 20 years, working exclusively on the coast, primarily in Long Island Sound region. All of our projects always have a coastal bend to them, and that's the expertise that we'll bring to the team. I've been in the coastal engineering field for 25 years. My academic background is a degree in structural engineering, a degree in coastal engineering, and that's where my two worlds come together professionally. While not here tonight, I'll be Jill Pietropalo of my office will be on my team. She has in-depth experience in coastal modeling, numerical modeling for sediment transport and tidal inundation matters. So her expertise may be drawn in as we go forward.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. We're excited to have both members on our team and really contribute to the overall project, because I think a holistic perspective, having their expertise brought to the table really is going to be the best thing for the town. So you'll see each of us will be covering different topics here tonight, but we will work as a team, and we so far are collaborating to get the best solution for the town and really all of our goals. Just to reiterate a little bit back on the site design, the concept that we put together, and I think this might have been back in September. Actually, time has kind of flown. We've gone through many iterations, but the latest, just very quickly, was looking at the parking lot, more or less as it stands today, replacing the existing boat launch. We had a previous discussion about berms. At that time, the berms were to be set aside for a later date. So there was a landscape patch or landscape areas buffering between the parking lot and the beach itself with trees. The concession building, as I mentioned, has been evolving and progressing. There's a seating area down in the lower left-hand corner. There's an outdoor plaza, picnic table area with a mixture of different surfaces. And overall, we're looking at basically the parking lot as it is, but having a deduction of parking spaces. And we noted earlier, this is a line that is existing edge of pavement, and we had pulled that edge in for the back of these stalls to give additional beach space. So with this plan, this is really the template that you're going to see that we're going to move through a couple slides to get fairly technical into hydrology of the site itself. Just to reiterate some discussions we've had in the past, just kind of the features that go into the landscape. One of the major limits is the mean high water limit at 3.4, you can see here, wraps around the entire parcel. The coastal jurisdiction limit, which is fairly hard to see but maybe better on your mapping in front of you, is at elevation 5.5, and it kind of cuts into the parcel itself right here. That is important because that is a limit that the state has jurisdiction over. So if you imagine this whole area here where my pointer is, that's where they do have a say, as in DEEP has a say, on what can go into that area. The next line that really I want to point a couple of elevations, because you're going to see these points come up over and over. There is a catch basin here right at the edge of the parking lot. Make a mental note that's elevation 4.2. So if you were quickly looking at this, mean high water is 3.4, coastal jurisdiction is 5.5, and this is in the middle. Out here on the road, it may seem insignificant right now, but you'll see why it's important. The catch basin at the road is elevation 5.5, and the park drive at the driveway is about 6.0. Oh, sorry, 5.9. I say that because these grades pretty much are the controlling grades that drive how this parcel of the park area, the parking lot area, really can be raised within reason or modified within reason. And as we go through, you'll see these points still come up. So I kept them highlighted because they're important points to note. Also note that the concession building is 7.92 and the boat club is at 7.9. So you'll see those elevations come up again just for perspective. And finally, looking at their high point in this corner, about 7.6, that drops down to 4.2. So about 3 foot of elevation difference across the parking lot, but relatively it's pretty flat. So you'll see here in a minute as to how those grades influence kind of our conversation.
May I ask a question? You're just on that slide. Can you clarify why you have FFE versus rim versus elevation as your levels?
Sure. sorry for the acronym. So the acronym of FFE is finished floor elevation. It's basically the surface of the walking surface of the buildings.
Okay.
Yep. Rim is actually the elevation at the rim of the catch basin. So the metal, the iron that sits in the storm drain, that is actually at the elevation of 4.2 or 5.9.
Thank you.
So as we're starting looking at the site, started looking at some data, and Craig's going to talk a little bit about the no prediction people, that really these are some of the values that are important to as we look at the site.
I'm also currently going to hand out a memo summarizing some of the things I might go over in my presentation tonight. So first a little bit about the numbers that Dan was using. So all those numbers are expressed in feet, and they're above a very particular datum, the 0 point. The 0 point on all of those numbers that are expressed in feet is a datum that is called the NAV 88 datum. It's a 0 point that is accepted by FEMA and is used in all of their coastal floodplains and riverine floodplains. It's data that's accepted by DARING in the state of Connecticut when you submit for site plan review applications in coastal or riverine flood areas. More importantly, it's a datum that your survey was based on. So as I talk about some of the numbers tonight, all those numbers are going to be based on that same datum, datum of your existing condition survey, and it's got the regulatory framework. This datum is different if you are a sailor or you look at the tide charts. When you get a tide chart, it's a different datum. Usually that datum is based on mean low water. It could be several feet different, right? So when we say, mean high water is 4.3 based on your survey, on a tide chart you just pull off the internet or on a map, it might say 7.3, right? So it's not the same thing. I just want to make sure that's clear. The other thing to point out before I get into the numbers, and I do want to spend some time on these numbers to make sure you understand the message that I'm trying to convey, is in this memo I just passed out, the parking lot at Pear Tree Point Beach is low-lying, right? You know that. And that low-lying nature makes it susceptible to inundation during just a normal predicted lunar tide cycle. It makes it susceptible to inundation then, of course, in any storm surges or weather events. And those conditions will be exacerbated moving forward based on predicted sea level rise. Just as a frame of reference, the parking lot at Weed Beach is around elevation 8, plus or minus, based on the same datum. So when we're talking that this catch basin is at 4.2 at the low point of the parking lot, that's 4 feet lower than the parking lot at Weed Beach. And most of this Pear Tree Point parking lot is below elevation 6, although it has high points near the picnic area, around or above 7, and a high point near the boat club at or around 7, and a high point near the concession stand at around 7. It all rolls down to that lowest catch basin. So most of the parking lot's really below 6. So it's 2 to 4 feet below the Weed Beach parking lot, which is why this parking lot floods very frequently when the Weed Beach really only floods in coastal storm events. First, kind of related to the predicted lunar tide cycle. Right, the low point in the parking lot is at elevation 4.2. So we just pulled the 2020 predicted tides from Stanford, just this coming year. And if you look at that tide chart and compare it to elevation 4.2, the water will exceed the elevation of that catch basin more than 100 times this year. So it's much more frequently than you might imagine because it happens at night, it happens in winter when you're not there, but it's happening frequently. And so where you pick up that number on this chart is here. Again, all this data I'm presenting is based on NOAA annual tide prediction tables for Stanford Harbor. And this is predictions for the 2020 calendar year. So that's the column that we're focused on right now. I'll get into the other columns as we move forward. The top row is how many times in 2020 the elevation of tide, normal tide, not storm surge, not sea level rise, just normal tide this year, is going to be at or above that catch basin rate. And then what we've done in this column on the left is saying, okay, well, how much water is going to be in the parking lot as water rises and gets higher in some of the higher tides. So we have at the catch basin rate, we have 6 inches of ponding in the parking lot by the catch basin. We have 12 inches of ponding in the parking lot, et cetera, et cetera. So coming back to 2020, this coming year, something like 4 times a month, there'll be at least 6 inches of water surrounding that catch basin, which starts to expand out into the parking lot. We're going to show you a graph of that. And something like once a month, there'll be at least 12 inches of water at that catch basin and pooling out even farther from the catch basin. And this has nothing to do with storms. This is a beautiful sunny day. This is just normal predicted tides. So before I go, I think the other thing to note is you remember Dan saying that the coastal jurisdiction line was about elevation 5.5. When the DEP sets the coastal jurisdiction line, it's actually a different elevation for different communities up and down Long Island Sound. They're replacing some old regulatory language, and they were basically trying to target the highest single annual predicted tide for any given year. Again, not storm surge, not sea level rise, just predicted tide cycle based on the moon and the sun. And that's at elevation 5.5, and that's what we kind of found in our data, that happens, 0, 1, twice a year when you're looking at the predicted tides. So they did a good job picking that elevation. The other thing that's unique about Long Island Sound, and folks that spend time out in the Sound understand, the geometry of the Sound affects tides along the Sound. So high tides to the east are lower than they are in Darien, and high tides to the west are higher than they are in Darien. And that has to do, if you can imagine, Long Island Sound is a bathtub, and water's sloshing into the bathtub and sloshing back out again. It actually gets to a higher elevation as the end of Long Island Sound narrows. And there could be that same effect with narrowing of the harbor here, too, in a micro fashion. So these numbers actually change depending on which beach you're looking at. So we picked the closest predicted tide table that we could get on the same datum as your survey. That's why we picked Stanford. That's next year. Now, I'm not really talking about weather-related impacts yet, but I kind of took a look at that just to see, because we know, and there are storms, like there were a few days before January 1st, right? The tide goes higher, floods the whole parking lot. And I wanted to get a sense for how frequently that impacted these predicted numbers. So I went to Bridgeport, where there's a tide gauge. There's been a tide gauge in operation since 1964. And I took a look at the difference between predicted water surface elevations in 2019 in Bridgeport versus actual water surface elevations in 2019 in Bridgeport. And what I found, that the highest predicted tide in Bridgeport was about 4.8 feet. And there were 61 times last year that a high tide exceeded the highest predicted tide. So the effect of primarily wind blowing out of the east in Long Island Sound, or out of the south in Long Island Sound, pushing water up on Long Island Sound, or pushing water up onto the shoreline of Connecticut, is a frequent event. And it doesn't have to be a Sandy or an Irene It's when you get that local coastal flood advisory on your phone, which you get dozens of times a year. And you know, the event we had after Christmas was 2.5, 3 feet higher than normal tide. It wasn't a significant event. It was rainy, it got a little windy, but it pushed 2.5 to 3 feet more water up against Pear Beach. So that exacerbates the conditions that we see based on predicted tides, and it exacerbates the conditions you saw in that photo showing the sand washing up on the parking lot. We then started to take a look at, well, we know sea level rise is predicted. How much sea level rise is predicted? Is there documentation for us here in Connecticut to follow? How quickly is it going to happen? We kind of say, oh, the sea level rise is going to happen, but usually we're given numbers like, oh, 3 feet by the end of the century or something like that. It's a global number. So there is actually guidance information for us to follow in Connecticut. The Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation has done a whole study on sea level rise and issued guidance for planning projects in the state of Connecticut. And their guidance is plan for 20 inches of sea level rise by 2050, as compared to, this gets a little technical, as compared to the last tidal epoch that ended in 2001. So we're somewhere on that time frame of what is predicted. There's also, I think, a visceral sense for people that have spent a lot of time at Pear Tree Beach over many years. I now am in that category. I was a kid playing on that beach in the 70s, so I have some frame of reference. But I think there's a visceral understanding that it floods more frequently. I kind of looked at, well, how much more frequently is it flooding? What's happening? So you can look at the tide gauge data in Bridgeport, as the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation did when they prepared their analyses, and we can go back in time. So the column to the left here is back in time. So we've seen about 6 inches of sea level rise over about 50 years. When I actually checked the tide gauge data from 1974 versus the tide gauge data for 2019, for the 45-year period, it was 7 inches. I used 6 inches for ease of math. But you can see that 50 years ago, which happened to be when the original bathhouse, where the bathhouse that's currently there, was built, that 6-inch flood happened once a month. And now that 6-inch flood is happening 4 times a month. 12-inch flood didn't happen, based on, again, not weather-related incidences, but just tides. And now it's happening. So if you've ever looked at the graph of a tide cycle, right, it's a sine curve. And the top of the sine curve is very flat. So if you adjust the top of that sine curve, you actually experience a lot more frequent inundation and a lot longer inundation than just a kind of linear analysis might otherwise suggest. So we now take that information and start moving forward. So what happens if we get another 6 inches of sea level rise from where we are today? Well, that 6-inch flood that 50 years ago was happening once a month, that now is happening 4 times a month, is going to happen 10 times a month. That 12-inch flood that didn't used to happen, it's now happening once a month, is going to happen 4 times a month, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the point that I want you to take away, and we can talk about the other numbers too, is that with very little sea level rise, the nuisance that might be tolerable today is going to turn into what may be an intolerable nuisance. Your ability to enjoy the park by putting a blanket on West Beach is going to be limited, because West Beach will be getting narrower and narrower more frequently than it is today. Your ability to park your car in certain areas of the parking lot and go out on your kayak and go out on your boat and imagine that your car is not going to be flooded is something that's going to be diminished in the future. So if we project out all the way on the right, the numbers get pretty significant. We have scenarios where now you're talking about more than 2 feet of flooding in the parking lot on a sunny day, just based on the normal tide setting. So this is the driving reason behind some of the work that Dan has done and Weston Sampson has done to try to figure out how to mitigate this moving forward and how to grade and drain the parking lot and lift the parking lot up in a way that allows folks to use the facilities as they have in the past. That you can park without sand being washed on the beach, without your brakes or low-lying areas being flooded. You can use West Beach. One of the suggestions is actually pull back that curb line on West Beach by 18 or 20 feet. And that pullback would be accompanied with a slight rise in the sand beach that's there. So you'll end up with more sand beach at a higher elevation, which is going to give you more basic enjoyment of the resource over time. It'll be great immediately, and it'll be great decades out into the future. So I guess move to the next slide, maybe.
Craig,
Before you
move on, I just wanted to just kind of once again come back to one point that you made earlier, and that was the kind of the reconciliation between the projected data at Bridgeport and the actual data, and how that applies here to the extent you can. Because my read on what you're saying here is that number under the 20, those numbers under the 2020 column are the projections, and they're likely to be far inflated over what those projections are. If last year's experience kind of applies to this year. Did I get it right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess without jumping all the way to the 2050 recommendation, because I think that there is some conservatism built into that number, and we're already somewhere on that path.
And I guess, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I guess what I'm referring to is the kind of the overlay of the actual, the weather effect versus kind of clinical numbers, right?
Yeah, the takeaway is that the numbers on this chart are based on just the tides without the storm surges. So when you overlay the storm surges, there's more events that flood than what this chart recommends. And these could be sunny day too. It could just be a nice steady wind from the east, but sunny. It could be a storm churning out in the Atlantic Ocean that's not happening to affect us. So these could be sunny day events as well. But certainly in your coastal flood advisory events, that's when it's really good. So we tried to take the information we gave you in the chart and demonstrate it in plan view. So the exhibit you're looking at right now is a study of existing conditions, existing survey, existing ground elevations, and this year's tide prediction, 2020 tide prediction, and no storm surge, no sea level rise. And you can see the yellow area is that plus or minus, the lightest yellow area is that plus or minus once a month event. And that orange or red area centered right around the catch basin is that 3 or 4 times a month event. And so as the water gets deeper, it spreads out in the parking lot, and you can see how much of the parking lot is being impacted by these events. So now we're going to kind of take this and project it out. What's the next slide? So this looks at a scenario, same scenario, just existing conditions with 12 inches of sea level rise. How does that change? You saw the numbers of the frequency. Well, this is how it changes how much of the site gets covered with water. So that red area is kind of hard to see, those blurry numbers, but I think that's the area that's something like 18 inches deep, right, in the highest floods, going out from there. That would be, okay, go back to the chart, question, the chart. Just so I can, yeah, just want to make sure I'm, yeah, This is the extent of flooding when water gets, I think, let's see, about 12 inches deep. And I think this is the extent of flooding when water gets about 18 inches deep. And along with the frequencies noted in that table from the slide before. So this is what a do-nothing scenario will get us at some point in the future as sea level rises. It significantly, in our opinion, in my opinion, affects the usability of the asset. So moving on from there.
Yeah, quickly to
Yes,
note, you'll
sir.
see that at this point with the 12-inch sea level rise, that there's actually inundation in the road. And as I noted earlier, this is about elevation 6.0. So in this scenario, yes, the parking lot is flooded, but also part of the road would actually receive some of that water because it's above 5.9, which would be a source, and it's also coming from the lower area of the parking lot. So just make note of seeing this little finger here, you'll see that continue.
Yes, the extent is that once a year event, right? That the single highest predicted tide, that's the farthest out yellow. It's going to happen once based on prediction tides. But as you get closer to that catch basin, those are the events that are going to happen with much greater frequency. So in concept, the grading plans that Weston and Sampson is looking at and we're reviewing are going to try to eliminate any flooding in the parking lot and provide more elevated beach along West Beach that's more usable more frequently. And so this is that baseline 2020 year with 0 sea level rise. After we make improvements, what are you going to get? You're going to get more width on West Beach, and you're going to get a dry parking lot in these predicted timelines.
And in this case, the improvements are raising the level, the elevation of the parking lot where we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that rim earlier was at a 4.2. By raising it to 6.5, see that there's no source of water coming out of that point anymore because it's now above these elevations talking about that. It creates a higher and drier area as a result.
And then to stress test this, well, if you go through the process of spending the money necessary and doing the permitting necessary to accomplish that, and what happens with 12 inches of sea level rise. So it's still the infrequent once-a-year events in the lightest yellow versus once-a-month events in the slighter, more orange happening, but not at the same frequency as they do.
And to note in this scenario here, so there is some flooding in the parking area, as obvious. I pointed that finger here across the road. This is because of the rim of the catch basin in the road is a source for that flooding. So at this point, you would not be able to get to the park because the road would have flooding. The parking lot would have some that 1 in a month occurrence of flooding there.
Just so I can understand it, so the raise in elevation to 6.5, is that simply accomplished by moving the curb, or are you bringing in sand to?
So in order to get the scenario, we point out the one spot elevation of the catch basin just as a kind of a connection point to relate to, but there would be fill as a result along the parking area here to raise that parking lot to get to that elevation that is higher than that storm event elevation. So if you build the parking lot, then the adjacent area, which is now the beach, would be tapering down, basically the same slope that's there now.
So in other words, you elevate the parking lot and.
Correct, yes.
You didn't shrink the parking lot.
And we did shrink the parking lot, yes. Like as I mentioned, the existing parking lot line is about right here per se, but here's the edge of the proposed park improvements. The trees are embedded into the new beach area.
But you're adding 18 feet of depth to the beach.
That's correct, adding 18 feet of
Additional
beach area. Yes.
So you're swapping beach for parking lot.
Correct.
Now, I recall
Or
a
the other
very
way around.
early meeting, I'm just asking these questions, with Jeremy, and he said that raising the parking lot elevation was really difficult to get approved by D. And he also indicated that when you raise the elevation of a parking lot in one area, you may have consequences from adjacent land. And I'm just asking these
Sure.
questions.
So we're going to cover a little about what these scenarios mean from a permitting standpoint, approval standpoint, and Devin can probably speak a little about too the area of this parking lot relative to Greater Long Island Sound. It's typically reviewed as a small droplet in the entire body of water, but I'll let him speak to that. But we will cover a little about the permitting processes. Each of these scenarios has a different path that we would have to head down, depending on the decision of the committee. So we covered a little about 12-inch sea level rise of a proposed improvement condition. Just to note, you can see here, this is where it's dry. Just from a modeling standpoint, that would be top of curve, which is basically water never exceeds the 7.0 contour elevation, and that's why you're seeing this sliver of white here of never having water exceeding over that curve line. Again, you don't have any grading plans necessarily done at this point. We're just trying to show the rapid modeling of how these scenarios will relate to existing and potentially proposed conditions of this park area.
So the water's coming out of the catch basin?
What's coming
The water's coming out of the catch basin?
down here? It's coming out catch basin. Yeah, yes. Because we're not intending on changing the road.
Or up the boat ramp.
Yeah, or coming up. Up there. So the permitting idea, Martha, you jumped ahead a little bit, but I mentioned earlier that we do have to go through the permitting process. Last year, we met with Dean to have a pre-application meeting to basically review at that time all the improvements we're proposing within this project. We went down the list one by one of the potential permit pathway. And I noted earlier that the coastal jurisdiction limit is, which is in their purview. We would go through planning zoning for proper proof as well, and they actually need to defer some to the state for reviews. That's pending the planning zoning department. But certain improvements would fall under the certificate of permission, and I covered this in one of our previous meetings. But I wanted to just frame as to the certificate of permission really is a permit that's issued for minor improvements. You can see here the list 1 through 6, and this is even a summary of their entire list. But you can see here there's a thread that's continuous. There's substantial maintenance or repair of existing structures, or fill, obstructions or encroachments. Substantial maintenance of any structures in place prior to 1939. Maintenance of dredging, open water marsh management, tile restoration, resource restoration, enhancement activities. Placement or reconfiguration of piers, floats, docks, moorings. Substantial maintenance or repair of structures. So there was a kind of an idea that the COP is more from a review for minor improvements, more on the realm of a maintenance standpoint. So if we do exceed through the state's eyes that our improvements are beyond these, it's going to trip into an individual permit. It's beyond the COP kind of framework for the intent of that permit. So we'll get here in a minute about how what we've shown you so far fits into those different scenarios. But most improvements that are proposed within this project do fall within a COP. For example, the dredging, that would be a COP. Working with building elevations and having improvements within the coastal jurisdiction limit, FEMA requirements would be a COP. The wetland restoration would be a COP. So really the item currently that would not fall within COP would be how much fill, that you were alluding to earlier, would be allowed within the parking area that would prompt the need for individual permit for those improvements. Parallel to all this, we've been working on the coastal area management report. This is a requirement of the zoning regulations and the Coastal Area Management Act. This document, basically, as you see on the screen, which is a quick outline, basically introduces the project. It talks a little about the background of what has happened to the site prior to now. Goes in general site characteristics, more from a scientific perspective of all these features, from the topography, the bathymetric, hydrologic, and hydrographic conditions, vegetation, landscaping, threatened endangered species or species of special concerns, historic coastal resources, site features, and other coastal resources, whether from beaches, dunes, coastal hazard area, and tidal wetlands. These are basically what are in the state statute for the policy what we need to comply with. So we review all these resources together, and then we compare them to what the proposed conditions are. So the section on the right really is the piece that's not complete that we're working on, because that all comes out of our conversation here of what is the proposed improvements that will go into this report. Once this is complete, this is part of the package that goes to plan zoning for their approval, the review. And they may push it deep to have a parallel review, but that's pretty much up to plan zoning's decision. But that proposed conditions will go through every improvement we're making and compare it to the policies and whether it's consistent or not with the policy at the state level, which is within the Coastal Area Management Act. And is there any potential adverse impacts to any improvements we're making within the site? So we compare every single improvement proposed within the project area compared to the policies, and does it have adverse? A conclusion of that is, if there are any adverse impacts, how are we mitigating those? How are we improving the site to relieve any adverse impacts? And, or are there no adverse impacts at all, and the project is within compliance with policies and regulations? So that's kind of what's happening next. Once we decide in here about where the overall site is headed, we then work on, say, chapter 4. So all this pulled together, there's a lot to take in, but we try to digest down to roughly 4 alternatives that we want you all to think about and to consider as we move forward. Really quickly, the first alternative you'll see here is a no change elevations of the parking area. And I simplify this a bit, but what some may say is the benefits of this is that there really is not a long permitting timeline. Any improvements without making changes would fall on a COP, which is about 90-day review. So that's a streamlined approval because we're basically in compliance. It's at least an investment into the parking area. But the negatives, as you saw from all the imagery we showed you so far, is that nuisance around the catch basin is now more frequent and more intense, deeper water ponding. It's not just nuisance anymore. It's going to be something else. A bathtub in the parking lot anytime there's time. And ultimately, this does not preserve the long-term use of the parking area. Or the park itself. So now we're having a water body within the parking area. It's not the original intent of the parking area. So we're not really preserving through going through this alternative here. Next scenario is saying, what if we're to raise the parking area 12 inches? And the 12-inch threshold is really unwritten rule by D as to what falls within COP, which does not. So that's the threshold that we're using for the 12 inches. So if it's 12-inch, raise the parking area, it would fall within the COP permit timeline, which is about 90 days. That continual nuisance is reduced, but it's not removed. It's just reduced in terms of how frequent it's happened and how deep, more or less, that's going to happen of that inundation. Negatives would be that there is a moderate dollars associated with this. There is going to be some investment. It's more than no change, but it's less than possibly the next option I'll show you. And as you see the rise in sea levels, or just changing of the tides, the short-term gain may not be such a long-term solution. That eventually, this is a scenario where it may not be high and dry, maybe for a couple of years, but in time, it may actually see more inundation as the tide and sea level rise changes. So the last option really is probably the highest end of the potential improvements of the parking area. The benefits are that the flooding nuisance is minimized to the extent practical. I mentioned how there might be some flooding on the road, and this basically would be in line with when the road were to flood. You may have some flooding in the parking lot, but the road's dry, more or less the parking's dry. So you're trying to keep them in sync with each other, so you can always have a way to get into the park and use it, and not have it high and dry while everything around is flooding as I mentioned. This would be a long-term preservation use of the park and the parking lot area. This would preserve the park itself for the intent of what it was originally designed for. The downside is this would likely be the most amount of money, and permitting would be beyond a COP, likely to an individual permit, thus longer time, larger investment from a permitting standpoint. So there is a cost to having the last option that is beyond the other two, and there's a longer duration for making these improvements happen from a permitting standpoint. So there are a lot of factors kind of beyond this, but we try to just digest it down that's palatable at this point for consideration. So that's really what we are looking to cover tonight. And it was a lot to digest from Craig's analysis, but I think, any questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense to open it up. Just to kind of cross the T, though, to Marcus' question, your take is that we can go up to 12 inches under COP.
Yes. We have concurred with DEEP that we can have a 12-inch fill per se within the coastal jurisdiction limit that would fall on COP.
If it's okay with you guys, maybe before we open it up for questions, I'm tempted to just ask, we've got Devin, we've got Craig, your new members, you've come with kind of, important credentials here. Just maybe share a bit more color in terms of, you understand what we're up to here and what we're trying to do. And of course, in part, it's to kind of really preserve this iconic amenity for the community over the long term. Something that we'll have to discuss a bit more deeply, but look, if you were sitting here and you were looking to make a decision, can you share a bit more in terms of your orientation, maybe Devin, if we...
Yeah, sure. I think Craig's analysis paints a really nice, pragmatic picture of what things look like going forward. Because we get enjoyment from being down in the water. We have infrastructure built in the water. We can't just cut and run for sea level rise. It's understanding what the impacts of sea level rise are going to mean for our coastal communities. And that, I think, in a nutshell, is what Craig did, is to get his arms around what does it mean in terms of nuisance flooding. It's not flooding that's going to be damaging homes. It's not flooding that's going to be wiping out facilities. It's nuisance flooding. So I think in that vein, it's coming up with what is a reasonable level of comfort by way of fill that works here. And I think a lot of things kind of zero in that, yeah, you're not going to put 4 feet of fill here because you're going to be higher than the road anyway. So we're going to have some practical limits there. We're going to have to be bound. This project can't cause any drainage harm in terms of shedding water on the direction, so it's going to have to manage its own stormwater drainage as well as tidal inundation drainage, as well as fit within the current regulatory framework. So I think as you start to peel back those various layers of the onion, you come to a pragmatic way. Okay, this should involve elevation of the parking lot in some way, shape, or form, and here's some numbers telling us 0 in of what that could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, as I went through this analysis, I kind of, leaned more to the table. One of the things I did was kind of start over with the survey and think about all the constraints and how I might solve that problem, presented with all of those constraints and maybe my specific local knowledge. And I think I came up with solutions that were very similar to the solutions that Weston and Sampson had come up with in terms of being an optimal balance, as he talked about in the beginning, between protecting the resource, which is not only it seems clear to me, at least until the DEP says, no, that's too much, we should be pressing them with this information in a new context of the world that we're living in, to try to get that elevation parking lot up as high as is practical. And practical really is the relationship to the road. And practical is really about that 24-inch level. And that was similar again between the schemes that Weston Sampson developed and the one that I looked at. They need at least a peak of that 24-inch. Devin has pointed out in prior conversation, as did Dan in the presentation tonight, that 12-inch rule is an unwritten rule of the DEP. So I think we want to be very thoughtful and prepared as we approach the DEP again with your affirmation to see if we can push that number up and likely get a result that you might want. We talked about, well, is 12-inch any one point, or can you kind of do an average of 12-inch that might be graded up and down for stormwater control? Would they be willing to accept that? Does that address their unwritten rule? Would they be willing to reconsider this unwritten rule, given, again, what I would call kind of a poster child for resilient planning? So I kind of came out where where Weston Sampson had come out, and I think the right target, if we can get the permits to do it, is that 24-inch number, which brings the parking lot, roughly up in line with the road.
Are there any rough rules of thumb, like to elevate 24 inches? What's the cost per square foot? I mean, I know.
Yeah, I don't think we're ready to talk about that.
Yeah,
I mean, at the right time, I think if we kind of settle towards a particular design, you guys can have that estimated. Because there is a value of fill, and there's a value of repaving, and there's a value of adding catch basins and pipes, and that stuff can be estimated for you.
Hey guys, I'm sorry, Frank,
Yeah.
could you just please take the mic?
Did you want to say something, Dan?
Raising the parking lot affects the beach, and was raising it more improve the resilience of the beach?
Okay, it does. A little bit.
Yeah, I think it would limit the nuisance of saying the parking lot. It wouldn't eliminate it, but it would reduce it. And I think that elevating the parking lot on the western side and growing the bathing beach or recreational beaches is just a benefit.
Dan had described this in one of the meetings, but the slope of that west beach as it approaches, the sand where you sit is about 10%. So by pushing that curve back 20 feet, you gain 2 feet of elevation rise at that same gradient, right? So again, it's more area, more usable area, but now that curb line is 1.5 feet taller or 2 feet taller, and so that's going to keep these tides in the water on the beach side of that curb.
There's another advantage to that too, that we're not trying to
Do the opposite.
we're not needing to build a wall to retain the parking
Yeah.
lot fill. We're working with nature rather than trying to force nature to meet a particular gradient.
Maybe another way to ask the question that Frank just asked is, are we confident that there's nothing going on with the beach area, the beach elements here, that in the same context of sea level rise and all the other things you just described to us in terms of the dynamics in the harbor, where we could theoretically go through this process, raise the parking lot, have a wonderful parking lot, and find that a beach went away in 20 years. Like, how do we come to that understanding? Because I guess, the other way of just asking that is, do we have a good enough understanding of the dynamics of what's unique about that beach at that particular location?
You want to start with that? Okay. Again, I'm a bit of a newcomer here, so to say that we've done three-dimensional analyses of sediment morphology is not quite the case.
Or can we get to it? Can we get to an answer?
You can get to it. The study of sand motion in water is tricky business indeed, and it's really statistical analysis of what winds are blowing in one direction. And anyone that's either lived around the water for a while or built a sandcastle and a wave has hit, it's just going to go with which way the wind's blowing at that time. So you can have a lot of erosion going or sediment motion from west to east, depending on your storm patterns, and then that will all be pushed back in a direction depending on other storm patterns. When we look at these things, we look at it in a few manners. We do the sophisticated coastal engineering modeling with statistical analyses, but we're not so confident in those tools to only do that. We also look historically at what's occurred through aerial photography, looking at the accretion fillets on coastal structures or groins to look at patterns over time. So I think to say that the beach is going to move, beaches just move, but nothing that's proposed as part of this project here is going to impact that negatively. There's a positive impact on the west side that we are adding more sand into the regime as we grow the beach.
Yeah, I think we also got a confirmation, an indication, which I think would be helpful to get further confirmation of from Daniel Missel, that we're actually accumulating sand between those two kind of breakwaters on the west side. So at some point, I think, if we decide to go forward with analysis, I think if we can kind of supplement the analysis with just satisfying us that, yeah, that beach is also kind of, not at risk or not, given something dramatic happening, on the planet.
Probably that needs to go, even without sediment change, even just looking at the analysis that Fred did, the elevated parking lot, like your beach is underwater all the time, you just have a parking lot to nothing, that might not work out. So making sure there is an understanding of how much dry recreational beach is left under the scenarios as well.
The only point I wanted to point out is we were talking about 24 inches, and I just wanted to be clear, that's not 2 feet across the entire parking area. We're pointing more to this, which is the lowest point in the parking area. At that point, it would be 24 inches of fill. But it would taper, as I mentioned, there's a slope point from here to coming down this way. So if this is a contour line, which is a point of equal elevation, so there might be more fill in here, and obviously a lot less fill as you get further here. So it's not a solid 24 inches across the entire parking area, which is really important because that's money and that's a lot of fill. We would maintain a positive pitch, and as the design progresses, have proper number of catch basins and locations that we can collect the stormwater and pipe it underground to locations. But this location is what we're saying the fill is at 24 inches or 12 inches across the entire conversation.
So, I'm sorry, can I clarify just on that screen there, that's the 24-inch in your scenario, 24-inch raised parking lot, that would be the results we would expect? Or is this the 12-inch raise?
This is,
That requires at least 18 inches. And so when you peak it out, you've got peaks of 24.
yeah, this is about 24 inch. This is a 24-inch scenario, more or less. The existing rim is 4.2. This rim is proposed at 6.5. So what's that, 2.3? Yeah. So that's at that little spot. So if you go a little further over here, it might be a little less as each side. So plus and minus for simple math.
So this is the 24 average, 2-foot average scenario, probably.
What is a 12-inch
It
image?
might look like the plus 12-inch sea rise model a little bit. Like
Well, that's
something.
a 12-inch sea rise, but is
Well,
it,
yeah, but so if it was just 12 inches of fill and no sea level rise, it's about the same as 24 inches of fill and 12 inches of sea rise.
okay, so we could use that
Roughly.
for your
Roughly.
middle scenario. I'm trying to match the
Again-
images, the mapping to the 3 scenarios you've provided.
And as Dan points out, these are highly schematic at this point because we don't have a real proposed grading plan we're working with. Right?
But just to match
Yep.
image
Yes.
to these
That would be
3.
about it.
Area flooding would be consistent with that. Yes.
That's 12. Okay, thank you.
It's difficult to see on this, up on the screen, but the little areas with the dots, what does that signify? Along the curve, right along the, I guess.
Well, I think those are previous areas of vegetation.
Yeah, so I think you're referring to in here, there were some dots in the schematic
Yeah,
we did before.
yeah.
So these were representing trees and the rest shrubs or vegetation
Shrubs.
beneath the trees.
As we go away to think about this, which is I mean, it's really helpful and very informative. What are you suggesting we should be kind of, what's the word, what am I thinking of? Like kind of mobilizing in terms of kind of considerations that come to some understanding of what direction we're going in here. Like, let's talk a little bit about, so what would be next steps here? Of course, you'd be asking us to come back and give you a sense of what we think about this, which we'll ask folks to think about this, and my take would be we'll come back, we've got another meeting coming up in a couple of weeks, and allow people to think about this a little bit, rather than jump into some kind of recommendations this evening, or thoughts this evening. But what else should we be taking away from this? Duration of the process?
One thing I just wanted to say that's important for something maybe take away from this is because of the heavy regulatory involvement, it's likely to be iterative. Okay, there's likely to be some give and take, and right even off the bat, we have some handshake agreement from the state on this 12 inches of fill. And from the analysis that we've seen here tonight, 12 inches may or may not get your committee what they want, at which point we may be in a position to go back up to Hartford and say, you said 12 inches, but what are we talking about? Maintenance is maintenance, it's still a parking lot, we're still going to manage our stormwater. What if it's an average of 12? Or what if it's 18 inches? Can that still fit under that? So that's going to be a pretty critical decision point. And I think what ends up happening, and that I see time and time again, because we do a lot of dealing with coastal regulatory, we need that desired plan to go to Hartford with and advocate for it as strongly as we can. And maybe we need to modify from there, or maybe that takes us to the next step. Sorry for jumping in.
No, I was going to say, to Devin's point, really it's kind of framing for you what the scenarios look like, or the alternatives that were under consideration. Taking all these factors in, the priorities, the key considerations for what the intent is of the project. I think it's important for you all to look at those priorities and characteristics and then put it into how does it relate into maybe this matrix or your own matrix of the information you've learned tonight. Is it important that it's accessible during a high storm event or during the tide plus a storm with 12 inches of sea rise? What is the information you've learned tonight influence on, is it priority to have it raised or to remain as is? So you've seen kind of like the worst case scenario, you can see what the best is, and there's somewhere in between that may be more comfortable for the committee. Where's the investment? And that then frames for us as to what is that pitch we're giving to the state on negotiating. What is the best scenario for the town?
Do you have a sense at this point if we were to go an individual permit as opposed to a COP, what kind of a typical timeline is for the individual permitting process? Or what timeline you think, can you give us a best and worst case scenario?
I'd say it's 12 to 18, maybe 24 months.
Got it.
My other sense of that, though, and I see this time and time again, is if they say we're going to let you do 12 or 16 or 18 inches of fill under the COP, but if you can go more, you can go the individual permit, they're kind of boxing you in the COP. If you say, you know what, we're going for the individual permit anyway, they would say it's not consistent. So you might as well just go with the COP. So that can happen. So that
I didn't follow.
Through our discussions, they'll potentially be revealing what the final outcome of an individual permit might be.
I see.
By saying, we don't need to review an application for a year and a half either. We hear you, you're being reasonable, we get it, you have experts on the team. How about 18 inches, in this format, right?
That may still be steered back to the
Got
COP.
it.
And that the individual permit might be an option in name only.
So I think, from my perspective, if you have a couple of weeks to chew on this and digest the information, if your direction is, let's at least explore what it means to do the 24-inch version. It probably starts with a little bit of work by Dan to form a more specific grading plan, and then prepare for further discussions with the DEP on that plan.
Yeah, I think if you can help us with the cost, that would be.
Yeah, that's what I'm stressing. That's what I need to get at.
So if you do get to a conceptual design, you can put a conceptual budget next to it.
Can I just ask quickly, whether any of these have implications for the surrounding areas? The boat club?
It would be designed not to.
And if you did the 12 inches, you could later do that, 15 years later, you could do.
It probably wouldn't be the best interest from an investment standpoint, because everything you put in, you're gonna have to take out.
Just
or you're gonna
paving the
raise
parking
that.
lot.
Yeah.
Now you gotta pave it again.
Yeah.
Where's catch basins, a lot of work.
But I think your logic is sound, that we give a lot of guidance in this with sea level rise, but you don't really know what may happen in the future. If the answer is, okay, we're gonna take a little risk on going maybe aggressively low, our risk that we're taking is we may have a problem in 15 years where we're stripping off with asphalt and adding more fill, doing this again. But we can bound that risk. It's fortunate it's a parking lot and not a nuclear power plant. And we don't have those abilities, so we can.
That's one good thing about this whole thing.
Devin and Craig, you guys, is there someplace else along the coast in Connecticut where they've had or are having the same problem, and what kind of solutions have they had?
Everywhere?
But
More
parking
specific?
lots everywhere, they're consistently flooding?
This issue is everywhere, and I don't think there's a consistent way of tackling it, but for looking at the cost benefit and risk reward analysis, just like you all are doing here tonight. And it really depends facility to facility. If we are talking, and I brought nuclear power plant up as an extreme example, but we have done work on coastal protection of very sensitive facilities, and the tolerance for that is much less than saying, okay, if we're doing a marina pier or a fishing pier that can be inundated with some regularity and still serve its function, though you get feet wet, you end up saying, okay, we'll go with that. But maybe the lifespan of a facility fits within the horizon of maybe it's a 30-year structural lifespan. So you look at, all right, we're only going to look at a mid-level between 2050 sea level rise because we're going to hedge ourselves in that. So I don't think there's anything uniform other than everyone's facing this problem and everyone's doing a risk reward.
Has anybody succeeded in getting, the ability to raise their parking lot, I don't know, 12 to 24 inches? I mean, there are examples of communities that have successfully gotten approval for deep on that.
I'd say the COP process is not terribly consistent across the board. So yeah, there's things that you see come down the pipe and come through pretty easily. I think the state wants to promote resiliency. The state wants to promote public access to the waterfronts. There's a lot of things that are supported here by the state, which is probably why they were amenable to the 12 inches, which, relatively speaking, is a large amount of fill. But the fact they've already took the hand that they're amenable to that says that they're supportive of that idea and supportive of, one, protecting a public asset, to allow for resiliency going forward.
Just one other thing, on the boat ramp, I think Dan, months ago, we talked that if the level of the parking lot raised, it might make the modification of the boat ramp to get the proper pitch an easier project. Is that, you guys feel that way too?
I haven't studied
Yeah,
it.
I think whether it was the work that Weston Sampson did or the look that I took at it, I think we both ended up using the top of the boat ramp as kind of one of the controls.
Okay.
and we were able to get the results that we needed with grading throughout the rest of the parking lot, really without affecting the geometry of the boat ramp.
Well, the problem right now with the geometry of the boat ramp is like 9 degrees and it should be 12 degrees.
So to increase the slope is
Yeah,
intended.
yeah.
So by raising around it, we have additional elevation change, thus make the slope steeper.
Yep.
Yes. Well, that was my.
That's fine. You had a data point that I didn't have.
Okay, I think to be good citizens here, we probably should exit the moment, but maybe what I would ask then is, we've got a lot of information here between now and next week or so. If you guys have questions, you can shoot them off to me, I can send them all to these guys, and then we can just kind of ask for some further feedback in our next session. I think that'd be helpful. I'm happy to talk with my colleagues and get that stuff to you. So, okay, so with that, and we've run out of time here, but once again, I invite everybody to join us for our next meeting. I'd like to thank you guys. Thanks very much. Very informative.
Thank you.
Dan, Devin, Craig, and Devin and Craig, welcome to the team.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Neil.